Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey everybody, thanks for joining another episode of the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. Excited to be welcoming Greg Harrod to the podcast, talking all about why our most reliable people are often the ones closest to burnout. Greg has spent more than 30 years in manufacturing, working with teams around the globe to solve operational problems and help businesses work better together. Today, he helps leaders find where communication, ownership, and execution are breaking down so they can make better decisions and stop carrying work their team should own. He's also a certified working genius facilitator, and he and his wife run a small sheep and fiber arts education business. So wild. In the same Kansas town where he grew up in his family's blacksmith and welding shop. Greg, thanks so much for coming on the Everyday Business Problems Podcast.
Yeah, Dave, thanks for the introduction. I appreciate that.
Yeah, man. I love all the connection points back from kind of the manufacturing and growing up. We obviously share that. We don't share the second part of that story with the, farming aspect, but always interesting to see the connection points and what other people, have going on in their lives. Awesome.
Yeah, I'm back where I grew up, and a couple of good friends are like, Greg Harrod, you own sheep? What? I'm the engineer. I had the computer when I was 10 years old. I was working on the livestock trailers when I was in the welding shop, but I wasn't pulling them. So
yeah,
I'm learning a lot. My wife and I, we got a lot to learn here.
I bet, man. It's I think honestly though, for people that are like that engineering mindset, like I'm not, professionally educated or trained engineer, but I think there's something common in that, right? It's that curiosity element. It's the wanting to understand how things come together, why, whatever it happens to be. And I think the sheep farming honestly kind of plays right into that, right? Like you have to be naturally curious to figure out like how that whole life cycle works, what you even need to do on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, yeah. Always solving problems. And what we're finding is on that side of the business is that people want to get back to those things that are authentic, slow down, and the pace of work is just so busy. You don't really have time to know your people. And this is part of, for us, kind of coming back to that slowing down and back to what we really value.
Yeah. I think that's a great segue too, like when I thought about this episode and some previous conversations that we had, so much of kind of what we know and talk about and, come across is like universally accepted, right? People talk about this type of stuff all the time. But for me, I'm always curious, like, take me back to when you started to see this genesis, where you kind of started to put the pieces together that, what the problem was around how we ended up getting to this point where people burn out, where people just, kind of lose sight of what is happening, and how we as leaders, and I'll put myself into that bucket because I did this for a really long time, right? But, how we kind of just take the situation for granted and then we're shocked, right? When some sort of, negative event happens. So take me back to your story. I'd love to just, learn a bit more about that and how this kind of, manifested in your own experience.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how it kind of emerged for me, because if you look at how I grew my career, so I went to Kansas State University, was an electrical engineer. As I said, grew up in a welding shop around equipment. It seemed like a dream job, which it kind of was. I got to go to work for Caterpillar as a co-op student. So I was in the systems and controls research group, worked on high accuracy GPS. So super detailed work, and I loved it. Did some project management training there, and then lived overseas with them for a while, moved back to Wichita, Kansas to be closer to family, and went to work for York International, HVAC. And then in that work, that became Johnson Controls. And I started learning systems and processes, things that you're very familiar with, best practices.
Yeah.
But I also did a lot more project management, but I also started leading a team. And what I found over time was the more detailed, tedious type work I was really good at, that project management, even program management, and I kept getting more of it. But what I really liked to do was leading people. And I noticed the more I had to do the detailed type of project type work, I could do it, earned a good paycheck, but I really liked the other. And then the more I got the type of work that didn't energize me, I got not full blown burnout, but I got closer to that. How's that match with
Yeah.
your experience, Dave?
Yeah, I mean it's similar, right? Like I grew up in the printing industry, right? And so my parents owned a couple of different printing companies when I was growing up, and then spent the majority of my professional career working for a company that grew through acquisition. So but to your point, like the things that really drove me and kind of continued to propel me was moving from the kind of, okay, I'm the the puppet master, so to speak. I've got all of the different elements that I'm coordinating and kind of executing. And being a young person, you kind of think that well, you know a lot of things, and you kind of quickly realize you don't know nearly what you think you know.
Yeah.
And the kind of fastest path to effective is through the people that have done it for so long. So for me, it was, similar in the sense that, working with people, kind of understanding how they are contextualizing the greater system, right? So for me, that's planning, people, process, technology, but how those pieces are coming together. And, as I was growing in my career, getting more responsibility, getting P&L ownership, and kind of continuing in those, roles, was very critical to understand how to get the best out of people, given situations where maybe there was some sort of negative impact, maybe there was some sort of transition event that was unfavorable. So oftentimes, while there's some overlap, I think, between stories, right, in the sense of really appreciating what people bring to the mix. For me, it was about trying to figure out very quickly, because there's always a shortened time frame. How do we how do we get to that next level, and whatever that next level happened to be. So for me, yeah, it's similar in the sense of kind of learn by doing, and learn by being there and leading, and that's why I joked about I wasn't always the best leader. I had to learn the hard way.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious. So for me, I was pretty far into my career
Yeah.
when I realized, wait a minute, I'm actually not enjoying those certain types of tasks. And I really do enjoy and get energy from these other types of tasks. And I was able to kind of define that, and especially
Yeah.
as you mentioned, the working genius model. Love that, use it with my clients, but that really helped me put labels to it. But how about you? Even now, can you say, yeah, I love doing these types of work, and this type of work, not my thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately the more experience and kind of exposure you have to things, it's just because you can doesn't mean you should,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
I think
Yeah.
that's the best way to phrase it, because ultimately you do find the things that really light you up. And I was very fortunate that kind of in my role, and I'm able to bring that forward to clients today. I don't like the kind of negative connotation around coaching.
Hmm.
I think it gets a bad kind of rap for a variety of reasons. And it's not anything against people that are positioning themselves as coaches. I just think there's a lot of folks that don't have the practical experience and ability to back that up. Right. But
Yeah.
I, was very fortunate that I got a lot of opportunities to mentor other people. And, to me, it's the same thing said a different way. But I think, to your point, it's, the ability to come in and not just solve, problems through a systems lens, or, help them to, unpack a throughput issue or whatever it is we're dealing with. it's the ability to, mentor and coach, right? It's the ability
Hmm.
to say, here's why I'm making the decision I am. And ultimately it's getting folks to, come to the realization like, hey, you can, it's the teach a man to fish, right? Like it's that type of thought process. So,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, and I'm sure you see the same, kind of types of things in the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, and the danger is when you don't have those open conversations. You never ask the question, "Are you enjoying the work?" When you have
Yeah.
your direct reports, it's just, "Well, we just go get the job done. That's what we do." And that's when what has happened in some cases, and I got a story if you want me to share it, but
Yeah.
you're somebody's good at it, or they think they should do it, so they just keep doing it,
Yeah.
and their performance at some point is going to decline, or their attitude, or whatever. And because they're good at it, you might as a leader you might keep feeding them that work, that with one conversation you could say, wait a minute, somebody else is who should be doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to unpack that a bit because I agree with you. I think ultimately it's on the leadership side, I would say it's probably a bit of, convenience, right? Like we talked before
Yeah.
we kind of hit record where folks are just in the weeds, right? They've got a lot coming at them. If we're talking about that middle management layer, right, that operations leader that is, trying to satisfy what's happening coming at him from above and trying to bring the folks, that are below and at other levels, at the individual contributor levels, along on that journey, right? So I've always said it's the kind of most thankless role, that is also the most critical role in any
Yeah.
organization because of that dynamic. So I don't think it ever, comes from a negative place or a bad place. You're not trying to take advantage of people, but I do think that you're ultimately kind of get yourself into this cycle where it's like, oh, Greg's a rock star. He's just going to bang it
Hmm.
out. And, but the thing I'd love to dive into is, ultimately it's those simple, Greg, tell me about what's going on, man. Like, what
Yeah.
else, can I do to give you support? It's those little moments where, again, we as leaders, I think sometimes can take for granted. So, how do
Hmm.
you make space for that? Right? Like, how do you set up the dynamic to make space for it when, Dave's the ops leader that is, burning the candle at, both ends and, can't figure out which way is up.
Well, just like you do when you come in with clients and you help them set up the systems, it's investing early based on what's most important. May not be what's most urgent, but what I think really works are regular one-on-one meetings. Whether that fits a weekly time, or that cadence, or whether it's every other week, whatever's best for the business. But having that face-to-face time, if you can do face-to-face, to talk to people about what's really going on.
Yeah.
And it's not a tactical where are we with projects, as much as it is how are things going with you.
Yeah.
And a question that I really liked to ask with my folks, and others have done this too, is tell me about what energized you. I even used a scale at one point, 1 to 5. How energized were you in your work this week? And then what de-energized you? What drained your energy? Scale of 1 to 5. Okay, tell me more. And have that conversation to say, man, this work is just, I'm getting it done, but man, I'm drained. And
Yeah.
it's amazing what conversations open up with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's in the little moments. And then I think the other half of all of those conversations is not losing sight of it, right? Because oftentimes it can be easy to have a conversation like that in an informal setting,
Yep.
right? Where you are trying to, kind of unpack what's happening, but then, you know, you get a call from, shipping and there's 1,500 boxes damaged or whatever, right? Like,
Yeah.
your mind just swims, and so not losing sight of those moments. I think the other thing that, as you were talking, popped into my mind, I don't know if you read this book, but it's 12 and a half. Was it 12 and a half? I think that's the name of it. 12 and a half by Gary Vaynerchuk. But he talks about, like, one of the things I love that he talked about in it is, the kind candor, right? Where
Hmm.
he talks about from his own perspective how he really struggled to give kind of, critical feedback to people. And I
Yeah.
think in the work that I'm doing with folks and conversations that I've had, and, even thinking back when I was a young leader, I think that's the thing most people struggle with. Nobody wants to have a confrontation or a difficult conversation. But I think to your point, in those little moments, getting a deeper understanding, having difficult conversations, that's where real progress happens.
Yeah, I agree. And if we go back to a couple things you said, one, if you have, let's just use one-on-one meetings as an example. If you have a leader, it means a lot when you know your leader prioritizes time with you.
Yeah.
So even if you're the plant manager and you're fighting fires all the time, if your supervisor says it's important for me to put it on my calendar, and it's there every week, every other week, and it doesn't get canceled, it gets rescheduled. Just those simple steps, honor that person and say, I care about who you are as a person. And then that's where you have this, you're building this relationship where one week it's asking about your kids, another week it's asking about, well, how are things going on that project? Not like where are we, but how are you doing?
Yeah.
And then you can sometimes, the best leader is the most self-aware leader. And sometimes you think you're going into an accountability conversation about them, but then as they start describing it, you realize, wait a minute, what's my part of the mess? I'm not, I didn't set them up for success. Now I can make a
Yeah.
correction before I go into corrected them mode.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's wise. And I chuckled only because I think everybody's been, in those moments. And, a lot of leadership is self-awareness and looking in the mirror and, kind of owning the things that haven't gone well. And, I like to encourage people to say, look at, like today's a new day, right? And you can kind of ask for forgiveness, assuming that you're owning the things that, are a real gap.
Yeah.
People appreciate that because you're not superhuman, you make mistakes. But I think where what separates really effective leaders from ones that really struggle, and it could be this could be an owner, right? Like it doesn't have to
Yeah.
be obviously they're in leadership, but it could be different perspective. But it's again it's that kind of lack of self-awareness, the lack of kind of ownership that people like individual contributors and other folks in the org they really struggle with. And
Yeah.
that's the stuff that ultimately kind of leads to that toxic culture, to
Right.
the all of the other bad things that come along with it. So
Yeah. I mentioned a story, but one of the things that I can't, I always come back to this story because Palanchoni, he's written Five Dysfunctions of a Team, Six Types of
mhm.
Working Genius, 15 books or whatever. He owns his own business. He teaches this stuff, but he
Yeah.
tells a story about getting to a point where Amy on his team is like, why are you acting this way? What's going on? Not in a good way. It's like something was wrong. But what he came to find out, and that's how the working genius model came about, was he felt like because he was the owner, he needed to be the one who was the cheerleader, the galvanizer, because of his role, and he should do it. Well, that was causing him, and he could do it. He's okay at it, but it was causing its negative effect of he's a jerk basically.
Yeah.
And someone had that vulnerability and that relationship to talk about it, and what they ended up doing was they found out that Cody on their team was the guy who loved doing that.
Yeah.
They're like, wait a minute, let's let him do it. I'll do it when I need to, and it's really good for our company. But if I keep doing something that I'm not good at, things aren't going to go well for our business and our
Yeah.
customers. And I see that sort of thing playing out at a different level once you get that awareness. And it may come from a conversation like that, somebody confronts you, or it may come from having someone come in because you can't read the bottle when you're inside the label when you're inside the bottle. Somebody
Yeah.
comes in from the outside and says, "Hey, look, here's what's going on."
Yeah. No, it's a great story and observation, and I've certainly seen that play out a number of times. I'm
There's
curious,
a
like,
smile. There's a smile there, Dave. I'd love to hear the story that came into mind.
yeah, it's just, there's a lot of them to pull from. So it's just, I think the underlying theme, right, really comes back to, recognizing these opportunities, and getting yourself into a cadence to be able to actually do something.
What?
Right. So, to your point about, figuring out who, is great at the thing, right? One of the ways I love to do that is by asking really simple questions, right? It's like, what does success look like, right?
Mm,
And so oftentimes we get into this mindset where, well, this is the role. And it's like, okay, but what's the output or the
yeah.
outcome that is intended, right? And like, what does success look like? And if Dave's really, diligently organized and just everything has to be in its right spot, and Greg really excels at this other aspect, but they're both in a similar function, right? Like, why do we have to force, the kind of square peg into the round hole? Like, why
Yep.
can't we be focused on what success looks like? Why can't we double down and give Greg all of the things that he's, tremendous at, right? But I think we get into this, kind of norms, if you will, because it's grown over time and we don't know how to make this change,
Yep.
to some other kind of delivery mechanism or, whatever, right?
What I love what you're saying too is you're doing it as a team.
Yeah.
You're not just a set of individuals in their particular roles, whether that's your direct reporting team or whether that's a cross functional team. You're looking at it holistically and saying, how can we together accomplish the purpose that we have before us?
Yeah, but I think ultimately, what ends up happening in most organizations, back to, kind of why people get burnt out, why we have these, kind of unsung heroes, right,
Yeah.
within these orgs, is the fact that somebody is the glue, and that somebody could be multiple people. And so it just keeps piling on instead of,
Mhm.
bringing people together and unpacking, what people are great at, unpacking what the goal of this particular function is, right? So how do
Mhm.
we drive the outcome or the output, right? Instead of doing those things, we kind of say, like, oh, well, Greg's just awesome. So let's just keep giving Greg more stuff. And
Yeah.
yeah, Dave's not as good, but we need another person. I mean, sometimes Greg isn't here, he has to go on vacation. So, I know we won't get as much out of Dave because, X, Y, and Z, but he's all right. And Greg can kind of pick up the slack. Right.
Yep.
And I think that, that is ultimately what you end up seeing in the far majority of the companies that are out there. Right.
Mhm.
And it gets perpetuated as they grow, and that growth is generally slow and not compounding. Right. And then we it kind of inevitably solve for all of the symptoms we see, right? Like, Greg gets frustrated and quits finally.
Yep.
We got an opening, instead of dealing with any of the underlying, again, root causes of the issues. So,
And what I hear you describing is you're building a culture, and this is what the best businesses, the best leaders do. They're building a culture that is based on humility and vulnerability
yeah,
and open communication. So you can have those conversations instead of just not having that hard conversation with the person about, well, they're really not performing that great. If a leader really desires for their people to thrive and flourish, having that conversation, I truly believe that you can almost always bring a person up in their performance. And sometimes it means, you need to help them find a different spot and a different
sure.
within the business or outside the business. That's kind to
Sure.
them also.
Yeah.
But man, there's so much opportunity there setting that culture that you described that I think some leaders miss.
Yeah. I think, in a lot of conversations I have when we talk about, similar things, right? People can often think that it's a bit, woo woo, right? Like it's intangible.
Yeah.
And so, I try to, balance that with something even simpler and just talking about, clarity, consistency, and accountability, right? Generally speaking, there is a lack of clarity, which
Hmm.
is, at the base of setting the tone for all of these things, right? We
Yep.
can't we can't hold people accountable. We can't be consistent if we don't have clarity. So even for, identifying who's great at what, right? Well, how do we do that? Well, what are we trying to do to begin with? Right? Like
Right.
we can't even have that conversation until we're really clear and everybody's really clear around it.
Yep.
Right. So yeah, I think that is some of the challenge for folks that are maybe hearing this and thinking to themselves like, oh, that, guys, that sounds amazing. But, again, it's like, what do I do tomorrow to shift away from what has been happening? How do I open the floor for some of these conversations? How do
Yeah.
I identify if I've got some key individuals that really are the glue that potentially are on this verge of burnout, unbeknownst to me, right?
Right.
So, what would you say to that person that is, maybe in that frame of mind right now?
Yeah, it starts with having an objective analysis. And I do have an assessment, a scorecard. It takes about 10 minutes to put together. Call it the Leadership Clarity Scorecard, leadershipclarityscorecard.com. But it just focuses in on 6 areas. You've got your personal leadership. I mean, do you understand yourself? Are you clear on who you are as a leader? And then around your team role and your strength, you understand yourself okay, maybe. Some leaders find that with the assessment, but they realize, I don't really know that my team, what brings them joy and energy and what discourages them. They haven't thought about it before.
Um,
But then there's always the communication and decision. That's another area. And then execution and accountability. And you've mentioned it several times. We can come back to it, but that operating rhythm, what are our meetings? Do we have meetings? Do we have
yeah,
systems at all? And then ultimately, it's the growth and the team health, because I really believe that you've got to develop your people so your business can grow. I mean,
yeah,
business growth is dependent on people, but that assessment or a similar exercise, just taking time to think in those categories. And that takes a pause, because when you're fighting fires all day and you don't take the time to do an assessment of yourself using that scorecard or using something else, it's just going to be another day. It's going to be
yeah,
the shipping department. It's going to be some buyer can't get something. I mean, we know how it goes. The machine goes
yeah,
down. That's how it works.
yeah. Yeah, it's as simple as it is. Oftentimes it takes, just coming in late one morning or taking a long lunch. I wrote about this a few weeks ago, but it's kind of like one of my favorite things, right? Like people will talk about this inability to, have some time to think, right? Like, and that's
Yeah.
really what this comes down to, right? Is you
Yep.
have to make space to do any of these, things that we ultimately talk about. But it's like I talk about this, encouraging people to practice fire drills, right? So what I mean by that is like, hey, just close your door, like
Yeah.
pretend I'm not here for an hour. All right, you guys go figure it out. Tell me what broke, and then we can deal with it, right? But
Yeah.
that gives you an hour, 2 hours, whatever it is, and then you start ramping it up, right? You can take a morning off
Yep.
once a month, or again, if you're not showing up, right? Like you talked about it, in the first part of what you mentioned with the assessment, right? But it starts internally, right? If you're not showing up and you don't have the energy and you're dragging and you can't get your head straight about encouraging people and digging in to find the like there's no chance, right?
Yeah.
So you got to show up that way before you can expect others to show up that way. And
Yeah.
again, I think sometimes we get into this kind of overload scenario where we find that one person that becomes our rock, or it could be 2 or 3 people. And you just know, man, if I give this to Greg, it's just going to get done without question. And again, it's like people are always shocked when Greg then hands in his resignation, and you're like, what happened? You were so happy. You were a rock star for me. I gave you a bunch of increases and, kept giving you more and more responsibility. Like, this is shocking to me. It's like, well, it shouldn't be,
Yep.
know?
Well, let's take this a little deeper, Dave, because
Yeah.
if you think about the listeners, I'm guessing you've got a lot of high performers who have earned their position and they do really well. And that person that you just described may be them. And they're the ones that, even though they don't want to admit it, they're reaching the end of their capacity.
Yeah.
And it could look like physical symptoms coming out, and or it could be your relationship at home. It could be those sort of things that are showing that you're the person near burnout, and your workload just keeps getting higher and higher because you're not quite able to have the conversation. You don't know what your team's good at. So who's it fall on? Well,
Yeah.
me. I'll do it because that's who I am. And eventually that'll catch up to you.
Yeah. No, I think you're spot on with that. I think a lot of folks that live that middle, leadership layer life, that's what it ends up being. And then, again, that gets transferred downstream, right? Because they're looking for those folks to kind of come up or to fill in a bit of that gap where they literally can't get to. Right. So I think that's how this stuff ends up perpetuating. And no matter where you're at in that kind of, leadership rung, right? Like I always say, you're always beholden to somebody, right? Mm-hmm. Even in an ownership capacity. I'm beholden to my customers, right? My clients. Yep. I own my own business. I, get to do whatever I want, whenever I want. Except for, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So if I don't deliver, right, I don't have clients. And, if I'm not actively marketing, I don't get an opportunity to land a client. Right. Yeah. And so it doesn't matter where you're at in that, diagram, right? Somebody else you are beholden to. And so I think there's, pressure regardless of where you're at. But again, it's giving some space to think about it and to do some of the simple work, because the work itself, right? I think you would agree, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. Is simple in the sense, right? Like simple, not easy. Okay, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So, but yeah, I mean, is that your perspective? Do you have a different view on that?
No, I agree with you. So often it comes down to having a conversation, for example. That's pretty simple.
Yeah.
Just go talk to the person. That's really difficult, though. That it's not easy to have the conversation about, even with yourself, to say, why am I so grouchy?
Yeah.
Why do I not want to get up and go to work? And why do I leave thinking, oh man, I can't relax? And having that conversation and opening it up is sometimes pretty difficult, but it's simple. Whether it's a 10 minutes you invest in the scorecard that I put together or one that you have, that's pretty simple. What you do with it is a little more challenging. But if we have time, I'd love for you on your post this morning about an example, a post on LinkedIn. You and I met through LinkedIn, and that I'm easy to find there too. But when you talk about a crisis that somebody's on the way to the hospital in an ambulance, you haven't had a safety incident at the place for 12 years, all of a sudden, to me, the way I read that was you got a systems problem, but it also shows how important people are.
Yeah.
Because what do you care about the most at that point as a leader? You care about that person in the ambulance. You care about their spouse. You care about their kids. And that, to me, your post was great. It just drove it home as that's what leadership's all about. It's about people. But yeah, if you want to elaborate on that for those who hadn't read it.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, it's an unfortunate thing. That was a very real phone call. And, the unfortunate part is not, for that company specifically. It's just, this is a more broad statement, but, and I've written a post about this as well, but it's, nobody is prepared to make that phone call. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, I have had to make a terrible phone call like that. And just, to your point, nobody can prepare you for that. So when you think about it, it's like, I don't, I don't have time to deal with, like creating this policy, and why am I having to think about this? And it's not a problem because we've never had an issue. And that particular company, Greg, that company was, even though they're a manufacturer, it's they do a lot of things with not a lot of heavy equipment. They have some heavy equipment, but it's a digital print manufacturer, so they have a lot of digital equipment, right? So generally speaking, not a lot of things can happen, right? Like in comparison, okay, I'll say in comparison to some other environments, and this was just one of those kind of freak things. But that's where it gets you, right? Because it's always the freak thing. It's always, the thing you don't think about. It's, I mean, there's so many examples of this that I've seen. A guy, this is like way back in the day story, but, a guy who, another printing example actually, but a guy that, been around equipment his whole entire life, right? And this is an old guy, which now I'm like probably his age or older, right? So it's like, but I was a young guy back then. But, guy was setting up a piece of equipment, got his finger too close to a nip roller and sucked his whole entire hand into the thing, right? And, it's just it's like, what do you do, right? What do you do? And then inevitably you're asking all of these questions, right? Yes, it's about people. Yes, you want to protect people. It's like, was this person under the influence? Like, was this something that, is like a situation that we have, that level of, unawareness? Is this a freak accident that we had no visibility, no ability to have influence over? Like, what are we dealing with? Right. So all of these different, risk factors and things that go at it. But to your point, right, underneath all of that is somebody who at best, right, is like, has a couple of weeks off and needs to recover. At worst, has a new life with, one less limb, right? Or no life, right? Like somebody that has literally lost their life. And imagine being, that leader, that owner, having to call that person's significant other or family and explain that. What would you even say? How would you begin to tell that story to somebody? Right. Yeah. So,
and that's where the combination of the work that you and I both do is about people. It is, but it's also about process and systems. And you have to have both involved. You can't separate them. And you have to keep in mind that your business is built on people, but it's also built on systems and processes. So you as hard as it might be to think through it, what you will do. At least you have a guideline for talking points when you call that person. Yeah. But it's a pay me now or pay me later situation. That if you don't invest that time to make your business strong in terms of your people development, but also in your systems and processes, then it won't grow. But you got to make that investment early on. That's been my experience anyway.
Yeah, I think ultimately it's, for anybody out there that likes, a good old investing analogy, right? It's like, paying attention to people pays dividends, right? Like you can't avoid any of this stuff. And, ultimately, when you do, the bill comes due, right? Yeah. And that can manifest itself in a variety of ways, right? Your key team member that you rely on, consistently puts in their resignation. You have a serious, safety incident that, at best you have somebody maimed, at, worst somebody, has lost a life, right? And, all those things sound dramatic, but it happens every day. It happens every day. in situations where people take other people and things for granted, right?
And it all starts, as you said, it starts with clarity.
Yeah.
You've got to have that clarity. You have to see those things that are subtle and you're missing, that they're just passing by you because they're commonplace. But having that clarity as a starting point is really what that's the next step, I believe.
Yeah,
As you said, what can people do about it right now?
I agree. Well, Greg, before we wind this up, I want to give a couple of things. One, I'd love for you to maybe just run through, a couple of quick thoughts around what are some symptoms that people maybe like need to look out for, right? Like in the sense of they've got one of these key people that maybe they've been pushing a bit too much on them. We kind of know that we need to do some self-reflection. We know that, we can take the assessment and get a sense of this, but what are some things people should be on the lookout for that may, give them some awareness that this is actually happening outside of just, taking a minute to pause or to do the assessment?
Yeah, I think it takes the pause to think about that person as an individual and consider if they've changed over time. That person that used to be energetic, that person that used to be showing up 15, 30 minutes, an hour early to work, now they're rolling in just in time. Or the person who used to be the one with all the ideas and they contributed, they're kind of hanging back. And that can be different for every person. And it comes down to knowing who your people are. But that's the biggest red flag when there's a shift.
Yeah.
And you may find out once you have the conversation, it's nothing to do with work. Maybe they have an aging parent. Maybe they have something else. And that's a better situation in some ways that you know about it, instead of that comes out as performance problems that you thought was burnout and you're taking action. So that would be the biggest red flag I would recommend, is just take a moment to reflect and think about if those key people have their behaviors changed, and negatively, of course.
Sure. No, I think that's a great takeaway for folks out there. Something that, they can certainly do kind of, even before they get into the cadence and rhythm of having some regular one-on-ones and starting to be a bit more proactive in this sense. So that's a really great one. Before we kind of, officially land the plane, for anybody that's out there and wants to connect with you, where's the best place for them to do that? Where can they find you at?
Yeah, the Leadership Clarity Scorecard is the best place to get started and get some immediate value that'll connect us, but leadershipclarityscorecard.com. So 3 words, leadershipclarityscorecard.com. That's the best place to start. Perfect. And you and I both hang out on LinkedIn as well, but that really to get not just to get to know me, but actually get some immediate value. The leadershipclarityscorecard.com is best way.
Perfect. Well, I love it. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast today and sharing some of your stories and insights. And thanks so much. We'll catch you on the next episode.
Yeah, and I just want to compliment you, Dave, for what you're doing. You're doing it out there on LinkedIn. You're doing it through the podcast. You just continually serve and give. And I know it's making a difference. We talked about Traco Ross, mutual friend, who was just praising you for the impact that you had on him as a person. And it all goes back to pouring into people. And I just really appreciate what you're doing.
Yeah, well, thanks, man. It's, kind of the point of the underlying tone of this, right? I think, giving without expectation, sharing your story, some people, again, they'll call that coaching, they'll call that mentoring. I just think it's the right thing to do. I had a lot of people that, gave me opportunities and poured things into me, and, so I don't know how to do things any different, so, but I appreciate the recognition, and, it's kind of ultimately what brought the two of us together. And, so yeah, man, I appreciate the support, and, thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity. Keep doing what you're doing.
Cool, man.
Thank you so much for listening today.
If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.